Clifford Carnicom on our studio line as a featured guest returning to the show. We get to talk maybe once a year. It used to be more frequently in the days from 1999 to probably around 2004, 2005. Just by way of review, Clifford is a scientist, a researcher. He's one of the founding members, or the founding member of the Carnicom Institute, formerly based in Santa Fe, New Mexico, now out west a little further, where Clifford has his laboratory and his research facility, and is working with a team of people on a variety of subjects, broadly under geoengineering and bioengineering, and what's going on with those areas of science and research related to the Earth, our environment, the sky, and particularly as it may have nexus or connectivity with aerosol spraying, or aerosols as they're called. Some people, and I know, Clifford, you as a scientist take exception to chemtrails as the descriptive term. However, it is like, a slang term. It's a cliche term, chemtrails. I don't know when it was coined, going back maybe to as early as 1999 when we first met. So that's a little background on Clifford, and I think the first thing is to do a little update or review all of your research right now, including something we're going to get into, which is Morgellons and bacterial microscopic analysis. I think stems back to somewhere in 1999 when you and I came together after a radio show, noticing there was weird stuff going on in the sky. So I welcome you back, and let's start with that. An update on aerosol sprays, a continuing phenomena, getting some traction in the news. If you do online Google research, whether it's chemtrails or aerosol spray, you're going to find a bunch of stuff. You're going to find news shows covering it in a very, I got to say, superficial way. And I think, Clifford, you and I may have been hoping for whistleblowers to show up between 99 and now, and some have in minor ways, but it just has not gotten any traction in the mainstream media. So let's begin with that. What do you think?
Sure, Alan, and thanks a whole lot for the chance to be here again with you. We have a great time, and you're pretty much on the leading edge of a lot of the topics that I'm doing work on, and this is no exception today. So thanks again for the opportunity to be here.
Sure.
And, if we just recount the history, at least in brief, my work did start in the beginning of 1999, and there is an evolution of the work that takes place, beginning at fairly elementary, but nevertheless sort of profound levels of knowing that something is very unusual and very wrong, essentially, about changes in the environment without any type of public involvement or discussion. If we take on the issue of just air pollution at the most basic level, we know that the effort and attention and organization that took place in this country during more of the environmentally active decades of 70s and particularly 70s, I suppose, where we had legislation developed that recognized the rights and the needs of the citizenry to a healthier planet. And a great deal of sacrifices was made, both economically as well as industrially, to accomplish those objectives. And that, unfortunately, was somewhat trashed and thrown to the wayside. And it's not a single date where things start. You can actually go back to the origin of our capability, particularly with aerosol operations, do use aircraft. That history goes back as soon as you were able to do it. It's a tool, it's a machine, and it's able to be used for things beyond flying, and a disbursement device can be one of them. So in 1999, it became painfully clear and obvious that something important and a transformation was taking place in our atmosphere. And so the simplest level of my work was that of just documentation, simply taking out a camera, recording it, and saying, "Hey, what's up, folks? You have any awareness or interest in what's happening here?" And that process probably took at least 2 years. And there's a whole progression of work that took place. It did get increasingly sophisticated and complex over the years, particularly in response to the lack of response by those that were expected to respond. In other words, if you have some type of obvious change in your environment, and we're talking about something you can see, okay? Listen, pollution and mass and material in the sky is something you can see. And the most direct and obvious way of recognizing that is with your visibility levels. This is why so much effort was paid towards the Clean Air Act and improving visibility. Los Angeles was a better environment than in decades prior when you went through the smog legislation. It is possible to clean the air, and those stats and numbers will show that progress back in those decades if you look at them. But there was a lack of response when the citizens justifiably and appropriately called for investigations and disclosure on what were these changes in the environment. And that's what forced the work to continue. It was unexpected. It was certainly a change in my life. I come from a military family, actually, with my father. I have, let's call it an awareness of the structure of society and the need for, let's say, order as well as organization. I'm aware of that world, and also respect for institutions that are entrusted to serve the public. I was a federal employee myself. I was a public servant, and that's why I was there in the federal government. I wasn't there for security. I was there as a public servant because I do believe in those ideals and those needs. There are other aspects of life besides just the profit motive, and government is ideally to suit that role. And so over the years, we saw the work became increasingly complex in terms of it would then progress towards environmental sampling out of necessity. If you say something's there and you ask somebody to look at it, nobody does anything that they're supposed to do. In fact, they're given statements of denial and contradiction to their most basic common sense. Then the process of environmental sampling has to start taking place. And unfortunately, it has to start taking place then at the citizen level, which is what I got involved with. That should never have been necessary. It's not the right way to have the work done. It's difficult. It's time-consuming. You're reinventing the wheel in a lot of ways because you're not using the systems that are actually available as well as equipment and resources. But it was done to the best of my ability, at least, and you will find a rather extensive record on that environmental sampling that took place over many, many years. I suppose the conclusion from that work, which was made many, many years ago, and everyone else needs to reach their own decisions, need to, read the work and become familiar with the work, and not just myself, but of anyone they feel offers verifiable and honest, good faith work. There's well over 300 papers that I have written now over the last 15 years. It is quite extensive, but if you look at that work, there is an appropriate time for myself, at least in a position, to simply conclude that our planet has been changed. This is beyond the notion of some, experiment or trial or project. The fact is, the conclusion that I made many, many years ago was that this planet had been systematically and deliberately changed in a physical sense. And my work started with the atmosphere. If you go to Maslow's hierarchy in terms of survival, you're not going very far without air to breathe. It'll probably be at the top of your list if you're getting cut off from something. And so you do not affect the atmosphere of the planet without inflicting great consequence upon everything that dwells on the planet, and then really the viability of life itself if you start toying with the atmosphere. And this was my conclusion, and it remains my conclusion, and that's many, many years ago. And an appropriate term for that transformation would be that of geoengineering. Engineering is the willful and generally technologically driven systematic development of a system or alteration of a system to produce some kind of result. And this is one of mankind's creations, is a discipline in science of engineering. Geo is our Earth, and that term is appropriate. When you manipulate, alter the Earth in a systematic, artificial way through the conduct of human operations, that is geoengineering. It has taken place. It is in place, and the effects are in place.
Yeah. Let's do this. That's a good background. I'm just going to take our first break here with Clifford Carnicom, and I'll give out the website too. It's Carnicom Institute .org, right?
That's correct.
CarnicomInstitute.org, where some of these papers in the early history exists. And then we'll come back. I just want to pick up where you left off, and we'll continue in what I will say to our listeners is a very logical sequence of discussion. I'll explain that when we begin our next segment. Clifford Carnicom on the line with us, and we shall return. We have returned with our featured guest, Clifford Carnicom, on the line with us. This is going to be a multiple part conversation. Clifford gave some really good background on the alteration of our environment. He is a scientist and a researcher, and started out, like he said, in 1999 to explore what was going on, which turns out to be some force of geoengineering or man-made interference with the natural rhythms on the planet, in the planetary environment, in the ecosystem, from the atmosphere down to the Earth itself. I'm just, and I want to say that Clifford spent probably about 2.5 hours with me a week before this in preparation, and I have some of the paperwork in front of me that's going to guide us through a very logical conversation from, let's say, 1999 and some of the things that you did early on, with some very basic laboratory apparatus to even more sophisticated things now, which you'll talk about. But just in summary about the sampling and a lack of responsibility on, let's say, the Environmental Protection Agency or other agencies of governmental basis not doing their job. And unfortunately, you and some other people had to come up with conclusions from using other laboratory systems. Can you tell us, before we get into the deep research of Morgellons and some of the other things we're going to talk about, but more specifically, what has changed? What has been released in the atmosphere to some degree that you know of, the sampling that you or some other people have been able to do, and how that has filtered down from the skies to the Earth, and that it's affected the whole ecosystem? Can you give us a sense of that, Clifford?
Sure, I'll try. And before doing that, I do want to let people know that, this is not a quick topic for me to discuss, and that library of work that I'm talking about is available through the site. On the homepage, you'll see a link that states research library, and that's where all the papers are that we're speaking of. In addition, we do have an effort going on right now with a couple of our staff members For the very first time, actually, there's been a need since the beginning. But to have abstracts of all the papers, since there's 300 and some papers, it's quite a maze, I understand, to go through the work. And so fortunately, we have some gifted individuals and skilled individuals there that are able to start constructing these abstracts. And you will find a list under the announcement sections of those that have been completed. And I'm guessing we're probably about 1/3 of the way through that list, something like that. So for those people that seek a sort of a quicker overview of the work, that's one offering that can be, made to them. Your questions specifically is on the types of changes that have taken place in the environment, as I understand it, and again, I have to summarize to try and sort of get something that people can get some kind of handle on. And I would have to say one of the main classes, I would say at least 3 or 4 classes are out there, but one of the main classes of materials that was identified over the years, and anything I'm talking about would be repeated tests that were made, usually through multiple approaches or methods. That's just the way I do my work. So if I say something, it's not an isolated event. It's something that just kept coming up and coming up no matter how I went about it. And one of those classes would be metallic salts, okay? And the actual phrase that I use that's even more accurate and actually more descriptive and meaningful would be what's called ionizable metallic salts. And that may be a loaded phrase, but in terms of simplifying its general gist of meaning, if something is ionizable, it means it can be electrically charged. And there are certain metallic salts that have that property of being able to be electrically charged. And it's a very interesting question that comes up is about what is your source of energy that you would use. How would you go about charging something? If it was, imagine an extremely fine particle in the atmosphere, how would you go about imparting a charge to that? It's really quite interesting, but one of the primary methods that would be available to us and is characteristic of this particular class of elements is the sun. The sun is a source of energy, and ultraviolet light particularly can energize certain metallic salts, particularly those in a certain section of the periodic table. So that's one way you could supply that energy, and we understand that that energy is there all the time, at least as long as this planet is in existence and we take care of it. That sun is there all the time. So you're talking about an ambient source of energy that's available to drive that system. Another would be potentially the directed energy flows, namely by human beings, systems created by human beings. That's not out of line at all. If those of us wish to research such topics as HAARP, this type of thing, high active auroral research program, where we are using the magnetic field of the Earth as a conduit to transfer energy around the Earth, particularly using both ELF, extremely low frequency energy, as well as radio frequency energy. So it's quite conceivable that, well, it's known that the sunlight would serve the purpose, and it's really quite understood that there's a known desire for human beings to learn how to, and not learn, but how to manipulate and propagate and transfer energy from one point of the planet to another. So these systems are combined. So this would be one major class of events, which leads to all kinds of implications. And we've had the pleasure and fortune of discussing some of these in the past, and we know they're full discussions in their own right. But another class of material that ends up just like you mentioned with the EPA. I'll tell you, I'm never letting this one go until it's taken care of properly. And that is that there is a very unusual filament nature, extremely fine, submicron filament structure. And to appreciate the size of what we're speaking about, you're not going to see this with your eye under any normal conditions at all. Human hair is on the order of roughly 60 to 100 microns thick, and asbestos fiber is on the order of 2 microns. Most of your filaments and your textiles and this type of thing will be on the order of maybe 10, 15 microns. But an asbestos fiber, and we know the environmental hazards that are associated with that if we look back at history. The filament material that I'm speaking of is less than a micron, sub-micron. Okay, and so by all rights, if you have such type of material appearing in the environment, and it's airborne, we're speaking about an airborne filament that's unidentified, by all rights, you'd want to know what it is. And your mention of the EPA remains relevant to this day, because such material was sent to the administrator of the EPA in 1999. And if you look at the record in history, you will see that at that time, the Environmental Protection Agency chose a course of action. And the course of action was to ignore, to not acknowledge, okay, to not even acknowledge the potential of an issue. What they actually did was refuse to acknowledge receipt of the physical sample that was sent to them by certified mail. So they did not even reference it in their correspondence. It was like nothing had happened. And this went on for a year and a half. So they sent correspondence back, but completely, and their choice phrase was in their correspondence, unaware. We remain unaware. But no acknowledgement of that physical material. And then that went on for 1.5 years under that vein before they eventually returned it because of a Freedom of Information Act that was filed by a third party. And at that point, they said, we have no obligation, no responsibility whatsoever to identify anything that we don't ask for. And that letter and correspondence is all on there. That particular material that we're speaking of remains highly relevant, much more than people realize. I have continued to receive samples from across the nation and truthfully from across the world. I have one from Croatia, and there's a major project that I have slated over this next year. I've looked at it already extensively. I'm quite aware of the implications of that material and what's happening within it. We'll get to some of that hopefully today. But that remains completely relevant and will directly affect the latter topics of our discussion today, which will make a transition into biological aspects of this. And when you ask for the classes of material that are involved, I've mentioned two thus far. Ionizable metallic salts, second being a very unusual filament material, and the third will be that of biological materials, biological components. Okay, and that opens up, truthfully, a Pandora's box for us, because the word bioengineering must also come into our lexicon here in our discussion. We are no longer able to restrict ourselves or isolate ourselves in our thinking and our consideration to that of something, let's say, fussing around with the weather a little bit. Geoengineering itself is much broader than that consideration when you're talking about Earth systems. But when you do open up the topic of biological, again, manipulation or direction of some desired effect, then we have, unfortunately, a very, very complex as well as a difficult, I think, subject to broach in sort of the receptiveness of human beings to even consider the notion that there may be some deliberate alterations taking place on the biological side of the world. So, that's a rough summary of the classes of materials and sets the stage that we must. In fact, I did an interview in a talk in California. The title of that talk was Geoengineering and Bioengineering, and then the subtitle was The Unmistakable Link. And that's the only time that I actually sort of publicly focused simply on the question. I had hinted at it for many, many years that we've got a real problem here, folks. But that was the first time I sort of laid it out and said, sorry, we don't get to restrict our language anymore at this time. We must treat them both in the same ball of wax.
That's great. I'm glad you kind of brought that all together here in summary. And we're going to take another break and then go to the next level of our conversation. Clifford Carnicom, researcher, scientist from the Carnicom Institute at carnicominstitute.org, is our featured guest. And if you missed part one, it's important that you go back and listen to the archive material. And I'll just give them a little hint, Clifford, of what's to come. I think now I'd like to go to your paper, Advances in Microscopy, Blood and Filament Examinations, which is kind of an explanation of how you knew everything that you just talked about in the last two segments. So we'll take a break. On the line with us in a serialized conversation, Clifford Carnicom, scientist, researcher, founder of the Carnicom Institute at carnicominstitute.org. If you missed the first two segments, it's more historical to where we are now, but you're invited to check it out later on. And we have, in summary, concluded that the atmosphere over the last number of years, maybe 14, 15, maybe before that even, has been altered. You gave the three different elements, metal salts, filaments, and biological components that we're concluding, and if you disagree, let me know, but we're concluding, and Clifford and his research team are concluding, has been released into the atmosphere in some form as an aerosol spray, commonly referred to as chemtrails. So are we okay up to that point?
Sure, that's fine.
Okay.
We know it exists, regardless how people wish to debate the source. We know that the materials exist.
Yeah, many samples, and just in summary, those samples have been offered to the EPA and other agencies, and it's like a hot potato, so to say, as the cliche goes, hands off. So Clifford walked me through four very important papers, the most important papers on the Institute site, again, carnicominstitute.org. And I want to start with the first one, which is titled Advances in Microscopy, Blood and Filament Examinations. And if I may, maybe I could just read a little bit from the abstract and then turn it over to you, because I can relax and I don't have to say much here. I like your kind of monologue on this, because you're the scientist. But this paper, Advances in Microscopy, Blood and Skin Filament Examinations, a slideshow actually was posted the end of 2013. And it says here, a maximum magnification that combines optical and digital means has recently been achieved. The development allows, under suitable conditions and sampling, a magnification of images at a reasonable resolution up to a level of approximately 18,000 power. This method has been applied to the examination of human blood samples as they relate to the Morgellons condition. So I'm going to stop there. And probably when you first were doing this in 1999, just by reference to the improvement in magnification, what was the magnification you were looking at under the microscope when you first started this?
Well, that's a story in itself, Alan. And Alan, let me know if there's any phone difficulties. It broke just a little bit on my side, but
okay.
Hopefully it'll be all right.
You're sounding great.
All right. All right.
Yeah.
What we're speaking of now are four of the latter papers that have been written. There is an entire sort of chronology, obviously, that leads up to this work, and I encourage people to visit that information, because what I'm speaking of has a history. We're not talking about something just appearing on the top of the shelf. And when I made an emphasis on that EPA filament material and the refusal to deny that, we're not going to be able to let that one go. And we could easily put ourselves back right in 1999, and that same problem of refusal to identify is staring us in the face, both in 1999 as well as today. So that tale of just the work on the technical side on microscopy is a rather fascinating journey, because it's a fact that the citizens in general are limited by access to resources. And as particularly as we're seeing in these economic times, those resources are becoming even more scarce. So we might think that we would like to gain information, but when your information you're seeking is dependent upon sophisticated or advanced technology, you can wish all you want, you're not going to have access to see it unless you have those resources and equipment. So that has always been a hindering effect in a very, very serious fashion. There's no doubt about it. So the process has been much more slow and much more painful than it really should have been to get to the state of knowledge that we have. And that's been a continual evolution on the equipment. But as an example of what you're asking, Alan, when I started that process of saying, okay, I got to increase my eyeball a little bit, how do I do it? My first venture into that, at least in this situation in my life we're talking about, was walking down the Toys R Us and plopping down $30 for a toy camera, okay, a toy microscope, and putting. I happen to have a SLR 35 millimeter camera at the time, but strapping that camera on top of that microscope. And by the way, the old Dutch inventor of the microscope would be proud to have that $30 what we consider a toy. But fact is, it opens up a world to anybody that wants to get involved in that. So that is how I started. And you will find, if you go back, you will see those papers that show a round, circle of vignetting taking place with that 35 millimeter strapped on to that $30 toy microscope. And you will find a whole set of images directly in conjunction with the correspondence that was going on with the EPA at the very same time, saying, this is what I'm seeing, folks. What is the nature of this material? And we may laugh, okay, of saying, hey, we're using a toy instrument, but I dare you to look at those images and not extract the information that is available to you within those images to study and learn what is happening there. And you will find a whole set of chemical tests were conducted under that scope. Everything was photographed to the best of my ability. And you will find, let's call it, profound information taking place at that time regarding the resistance of that particular material to any type of attempts to essentially penetrate it or find out what its nature was. A most unusual material. And then that process will gradually improve over the years. And a middle stage of this would be a regular, what you call, laboratory type grade, mid-grade microscope, decent quality instrument, and then the conjunction with digital means, namely a digital camera. And same kind of thing. My first digital camera that I strapped on that thing and used for many, many years was a $40 webcam, okay, on top of a $350, $400 scope. But nevertheless, there were commensurate improvements in the image quality, and they were really quite amazing. Conventional microscopy is limited to about 1,000. We're really in a strange world in terms of microscopy, because conventional microscopy, most people are looking on the nature of roughly 400 times, somewhere near. If they're lucky, they're up to 1,000 power, and that has to do with the physical limitations of lenses. Okay, and then you'll hear of electron microscopes, and suddenly you're up like at 250,000 to 500,000 power. And like the big puzzle that all of us should be asking is, what the heck's happening in between? Okay, you mean to tell me you go from 1,000 to 250 and there's nothing in between in terms of current technology? That's fortunately not true anymore. But you want to know an interesting story? Go look at Royal Raymond Rife, and what he was doing in the 30s. And that person was seeing work at the 30 to 40,000 power. And the importance here is that it makes a difference. If you are limited to low power work, you are extremely limited on your access to information. Even with an electron microscope, you have serious limitations because the material must be dead. The way it works is bounces electrons off of something. And not only that, electron microscopes are not able to penetrate inside of things very well because they're bouncing those electrons off an exterior shell. So this whole middle ground of, call it 20, 30, even 10,000 power, is an open field in terms of what we should have access to as consumers and citizens, but it's been very hard coming. Those with means can buy such equipment, but it's generally certainly not available until you have another 20 grand to spill out for a scope, and I'm working with things that are $200 and $300 type thing. Over the years, fortunately, the digital cameras continue to improve, as we know. and the price dramatically dropping. And my work was sort of a unique combination. Now, I'm a jury rigger by nature, and so I'm always sort of constructing things. And that webcam was a construct of my own at the time. And that process has improved, but also the digital cameras have improved. And my work is routinely on the order of roughly 5 to 10,000 power. And that difference is extremely significant with respect to the issues that we are speaking of, because that increase is necessary in order to present and show a reasonable level of detail about a very important structure that makes its presence under that magnification. Now, you and I talked about that filament being submicron. That's at the borderline of what sort of a person can see when you start getting up around 1,000 power or something like that to pick out that individual filament. Go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, so 1,000 power gives you a look at filaments submicron
just barely.
Just barely to some degree.
Yep.
Okay.
You'll know that they're there, and they're going to be easier to recognize because of their linear dimension.
Yeah.
You're not going to be able to see anything, across dimension, but the length, because it has that form, you'll be able to see it. The topic we are leading to is that from the very beginning, as I was able to gradually increase my sort of access to those filaments in terms of seeing them, magnification particularly, it was what is inside of those filaments that is the real heart. So we might think something submicron is the story. That's not the story.
Yeah.
What is the story is what is inside those filaments.
Yeah. Right? All right. So, again, we're in perfect chronology of our prep a week ago to do this. And I want to take another break, and we're going to go from advances in microscopy, blood and skin filament examinations, to Morgellons, a working hypothesis, neural, thyroid, liver, oxygen, protein, and iron disruption, which is, as you said to me last week, the most important paper that you've put up there, some 100+ pages, if I remember correctly, and we'll ask you to kind of synthesize and abstract that as we go deeper in magnification with your capacities in the laboratory. Clifford Carnicom, our scientist researcher, on the line, and we shall return. CarnicomInstitute.org if you want to bypass the time between now and the next conversation segment. Clifford Carnicom, our featured guest, on the line with us of the Carnicom Institute, CarnicomInstitute.org, scientist, researcher, founder of this institute, foundation, and we just finished a segment on advances in microscopy and the work that has accelerated and improved because of higher magnification capacities in Clifford's laboratory. Following along with my guidelines here, we decided to go next to a paper titled Morgellons, a working hypothesis, neural, thyroid, liver, oxygen, protein, and iron disruption. And I'm going to turn it over to you. Other than saying that this paper, if you look online, seeks to identify a host of organic compounds that are likely to compromise the core physical structure of biologically produced filaments, characteristic of the Morgellons condition. And you talked about filaments, and now the higher magnification allows you to go deeper into the filaments. So I'm going to turn that over to you, but you might want to talk a little bit about Morgellons as a condition in the human body too, why that's important, and how these filaments are being identified or where they show up, okay? And then I'll let you run with it.
Sure, Alan. Thank you very much. I'm going to try to give a little wrap-up on that paper that I was speaking of on the microscopy. And the subject of that paper that we're speaking of, advances in microscopy, are what I call the most detailed images that I've been able to provide with improved equipment of two major subjects. The first would be a rather detailed ability to examine the blood and changes that are occurring in the blood, and particularly the appearance of a particular structure. Now, I have couched my language for years on this structure, because no sort of authority will come forth and give a, call it, classification to it. I am at the stage now where I do need to attach a title to it that is more representative of what I see. And that title that I use at this point is what I'm calling cross-domain bacteria. That's a discussion in itself, but we're talking about a living organism that is very extremely small in size, about the smallest size possible on the bacterial level. From there on, it'd be viruses, which I wouldn't be able to see. And when I started talking about what is of greatest interest is the interior of those filaments, the evidence will show that there is a direct correspondence and linkage between the presence of this bacterial, what I call cross-domain bacterial component, frequently found within blood and biology in general. We're going to talk about that more later. And the identical structures as found repeatedly over and over and over a period of many, many years within filament structures, especially the environmental filament structures that I'm speaking of, as well as now the crossover into the world of biology in this term called Morgellons condition. That term is actually losing favor with me more and more as I go along, because it's a popular term like the other term we spoke of that does nothing to actually embody the true nature or scope of what we're speaking of. And it has again, language is important, how it's used, but it has the notion that somehow we're talking about some isolated condition that can be restricted to a few people, and we keep it as a curiosity piece in our lives and treat it as some type of exception to the rule. If you actually are willing to look at the information available to you, you will find that my work shows a contradiction to that thinking, and we're talking about a situation that is much more extensive and much more prevalent than most of us are willing to admit.
Let me just because I know what you're saying, but I'm going to do a little clarification here. So just by recap, Morgellons has been a descriptive term for a certain kind of disease or condition, but maybe even illness that people have experienced by these filaments showing up, coming out of the skin, and creating various undesirable, and that might be a soft term, undesirable symptoms and impacts, lesions, and you can expand on that. And what you're saying is that that even though it's not showing up in other people, I don't have any lesions, I don't have any Morgellons condition symptoms, that the bacteria that's inside the filament is way more common to all people, to blood samples, and maybe to even more than the human being. So did I summarize?
That's correct. Okay. We are going to talk it more, and I will say forcefully that the criteria that uses a skin presence, a presence of the skin of a particular filament, is not, and I'll repeat it, it is not a sufficient criteria in which to establish the existence of this condition. This would be my statement. I'm not a doctor at all. I'm an independent researcher, okay? Mm-hmm. But as an independent researcher and as a citizen, I will state that this is conclusively what the evidence shows. Skin conditions or anomalies in skin conditions are not a sufficient criteria. My own opinion, again, based upon the bulk of research, is that the presence of this particular bacterial form is a primary criteria upon which the work would be based. And, along with the question about access to equipment, I think another attribute that we must at least acknowledge is the willingness to look at something. You go ahead and get a blood test, and you'll be run through a certain machine that's looking for certain things already well defined, and go ask if anybody actually looks at your blood. You're not going to find it very often. And unless you have a test that actually is designed, in other words, if you don't know what you're looking for, you're not necessarily going to see it, okay? But the willingness to even look at the situation that we're speaking of is a primary issue.
Yeah, let me just so I understand this, and I'm standing in the shoes of our listeners, Clifford, that the conventional blood testing that's done now to do diagnostic work does not have the capacity to recognize the kind of bacteria that you're talking about that you've discovered with high-powered microscopy in the filaments.
I'm not aware of any blood tests or actual overt sort of simply looking at things that is willing to address the existence and pervasiveness of the existence of a particular bacterial structure, at least to the best of our ability, cross-domain bacterial structure, that exists on a widespread basis within the human population, based upon available evidence. Again, acting as an independent researcher.
That's interesting.
Okay?
So
and
is
unfortunately, it's more than interesting, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Not to be flippant.
No. I mean, interesting in the sense of a profound revelation is what I'm talking about, and maybe I need to say it differently. But the systems for blood analysis are not designed to find this. There'd be some other scientific or laboratory system to recognize the bacteria. Is that true?
Yes. Okay. And I hate, I feel like you go on these diversions because they're not diversions in my own mind. But we talk about looking at something very briefly. That environmental filament that we're speaking of.
Yeah.
There was a paid laboratory test. There was a company that was enlisted to identify that material. When that report was given, I was fully, let's say, aware that report was false. The information in the report stating what this material was plain false, to the point where I eventually met with the owner of that company. Okay, and I was to present my concerns about why I knew that this report was false, and I had 9 items on the list. When I met with that individual, I went through item 1, okay, and it had to do with looking at it. Okay, you just look at it under a microscope. You don't just run it through a machine necessarily and push a button without interpreting it and looking at it. I made it through number 1, which has to do with the act of measurement visually, and I made it to number 2, and the individual stated, "This meeting is over."
Yeah.
Okay.
So
when you talk about the obvious, one of the most obvious things in life is to be willing to look at something.
Yeah. The only thing I can think of is some kind of influential pressure on a guy like that or anybody else that might have an independent lab at one level, and maybe at another level talk about cover-up, or if he wouldn't do it, my question would be, and I want to take another break here and continue, but just to finish this segment, Clifford, I ask you the question, why? I mean, why would he say our discussion is over? Where does that come from?
Well, I can't speak for him, but I finally wrote up that session. I actually waited 12 years to write that up, but there is a report on the site called A False Report, where I presented the account that happened there because the public had a right to know it. And I gave that individual a letter at the time. And when he did that, I actually had a letter prepared ahead of time. Let's just say I had a little bit of intuition that it might not all go according to citizen needs. And I told that individual that this information that is being stated as being true, that it is false, and I will make it known to the public. And it took me 12 years before I did so, but I did make that information available. In terms of why we can read into things forever, but the facts are that the meeting was terminated upon presentation of the obvious errors within that report.
All right. Let's do this. We're going to take another break here, all right? And we'll just pick up on this particular paper, Morgellons, a working hypothesis, neural, thyroid, liver, oxygen, protein, and iron disruption. And we'll be right back to continue. Clifford Carnicom, our featured guest, on the line with us. We're going deeper into somewhat of a mystery, and I want to just summarize the last segment, in case for some reason you just tuned in and you need to listen to the numbers 1 through 4 of our conversation, and what I said to Clifford off mic, and he said, I wish you would have said it on mic, so I'm going to say it, that the one laboratory that you were talking about walked away from the table and said, we're done here, when you probe deeper into why they didn't do certain things in terms of evaluating material that was submitted for analysis, including the filaments and bacteria that we've been talking about. And this is not the first time, whether it's the APA that we talked about in segment 1 and segment 2, that there has been a general refusal of certain institutions, not your foundation, to go deeper into this substance. And I asked why, and really there's not an answer that you can give, other than I said maybe it's a cover-up. Maybe either nobody wants to get to it when it's a certain level of knowledge, or there's an unknowing and they don't want to go further for whatever reason, or they've been told by some other authority, do not go there. I'll let you take it over, and you continue with this working hypothesis about Morgellons, and particularly how it's impacting people at other levels, not necessarily skin lesions or surface eruptions, but at other levels.
Yes, thank you very much, Alan. And we recall the statement that I made earlier that the body of work that I make available provides the conclusion that anomalies or alterations in the skin are not sufficient in any way to determine whether or not this particular situation exists. And I am not a doctor, all right? The qualifiers are there all the time. I'm not speaking as a doctor. I'm speaking as an independent researcher, as I have the right to do. And every citizen has the right to seek knowledge and to seek the truth. And this is what I do. So why do I say that? I say that because the filaments, again, if you were to take that filament that somebody might be claiming as being a surface event, and you were willing, again, to look at that filament and look inside of that filament, you would see certain structure. And within that structure, you would see the repeated presence of this, what I call cross-domain bacteria. That term gets a little bit twisted when we really understand where it leads to later on. We get into the science fiction world. We're watching X-Files lately quite a bit, and I have to say, it looks like we've got our own X-Files. We don't need a show to lead it to us. But I'll try to get to something a little bit later. But again, the interior is what's important. And so that particular structure has been the focus of my interest for years. I have to say, it hasn't called too much public attention. There hasn't been too much sensationalism about this particular submicron structure. But I have never lost focus and concentration on seeking the nature and identity of that particular life form, which is what it is. And this is what I would state is the primary criteria that we should at least be looking at, again, willingness to look at or consider. And the impact especially upon the blood. There's many, many impacts, and that's what this paper is about. But that, I think, is a more reasonable manner in which to approach what we're speaking about than trying to keep something on the surface and isolate it. Now, the paper that we're speaking of is the attempt on my side over a period of years to synthesize information accumulated over many, many years that tries to give an overall sort of a view and summary about what is known and what effects might occur from such an organism and what we might be able to do about such a thing. That's what this paper is about. The paper is entitled Morgellons, a Working Hypothesis, and the subtitle is Neural Thyroid Liver Oxygen Protein and Iron Disruption. Whether it's the most important paper, I don't know, but it was certainly the most extensive. It took me over a year There's other things that it's hard for me to weigh in terms of importance, in terms of impact. But it took me well over a year of effort on this paper. And the paper is broken up into 3 parts. And again, the results of the paper were dependent, again, on access to technology. Now, our equipment is very old, but we did acquire a rather important instrument. And the instrument uses what's called infrared technology, okay? A spectrophotometer is what it's called. Everything in this world, any mass or material, especially organic materials, but every matter in this world, if you subject it to electromagnetic energy, it will respond. It will do something. And organic molecules are particularly responsive to what is called infrared energy, that beyond just what you can see with your eyes. And if you subject this organic material to this type of energy, it will respond in ways that are so important and so repeatable that decades have been spent cataloging and characterizing that response to that energy. Okay? And so we know a whole lot about how organic materials respond to infrared energy. And if you have an instrument that's able to measure this and to record it, you can gain valuable insight. You don't just push a button and get a readout about what something is made of, the way we're being conditioned in our world to think everything is so simple. But you do get very valuable insight into the chemical and molecular nature of that organic material. Now, it's still actually at a fairly generalized level when you go into the detail that's available to us in this world. But it nevertheless is valuable information. And so in a sense, it gives you the building blocks, major chemical building blocks. What are called functional groups? They're called functional groups. And these are major building blocks of the organic world, including our bodies, including any living organism. And so the Institute gained access to this instrument. And so what I was able to do, after waiting patiently for years for such technology, was to be able to put the very skin filaments that we're speaking of, that very type of material, into this instrument. It took months to learn how to, avoid errors. There's errors in every single process there is, but to try and get a reliable readout from this particular biological sample type. And so this paper is written in 3 parts. The first is that process of using this technology to gain access to that information, which had never been done before, certainly on my side. And so we have information about the likely or probable organic constituents of this material. That's the first. It's important. It's absolutely, listen, think about the problem. If you want to know what something is, you got to find out what it's made out of first. And unfortunately, we have a decade and a half before we even get to that point, okay? It's frustrating as heck. This kind of stuff should be available to us within weeks if you had full disclosure. But nevertheless, we have some information, and that's what the first part of the paper is. Each section is roughly 30-some pages. That's probably the least enjoyable part of the paper to read. Not that any of it will necessarily be enjoyable to you, but that part is probably the least enjoyable to read. But nevertheless, probably the most important because it is a foundation upon which the other 2 parts are written. If you don't know what you're talking about, you have no right to write about it. The second part of the paper, so the first part is called identification. The second part is called potential health impacts of the various functional groups and components. This part starts to raise the question that what if these certain functional groups existed? What if you were to find a certain, what's called carboxylic acid, okay? What if you were to find this? What if you were to find an amine? What would these things mean? And no pun intended there, but that phrase is implicit in the word amino acids that many of us are aware of. This is the type of information you're talking about. If you're talking about amino acids, you're talking about proteins. So if you have the ability to gain these building blocks, then you can start to ask the question, what might it be, what might be its effect upon the human body? If you had the presence of excessive acids, let's say, if you had the presence of amino acids within an organism, what might that mean about the lack of a presence of amino acids within your body? Is it possible that there might be a diversion? Okay. Tremendous work has been done on the blood also in terms of oxygen flow, ability to carry oxygen. But this is what the second part of the paper looks at, is what would be the expected health impacts. And that topic are subtitled at the beginning, where we talk about, the phrase is, here it is, right? Disruption of a variety of major body processes, including as a minimum, regulation of metabolism by the thyroid, potential liver enlargement, a decrease of oxygen in the circulatory system, the utilization of amino acids important to the body, the oxidation of iron, and the potential impact of neural pathways. Okay, these are the subjects of consideration that arise through interpretation and analysis of the existence of these functional groups. Okay.
All right.
So, go ahead.
I'm going to take another break here and pick up the conversation. Again, understanding the significance of the research and your very thorough explanation of how this was done and the science behind it. But I want to go to the final segment here. As they say, the bottom line impact on human health, human beings, physical, emotional conditions, and maybe even bridge to the new biology, how this cross-domain bacteria is showing up in the broader picture of the planet. And that's going to be our concluding and final segment, at least for today, just because we can just cover so much. And it is a mindful, not minefield, a mindful. We shall return. All right, if you just joined us, and when I say us, Clifford Carnicom and yours truly here in a very in-depth conversation, probably one of the most significant in our series that Clifford and I have done, as we talked about maybe over the last, 13, 14 years together. Clifford, a scientist and researcher, and I've had the benefits of conversations with you many times. That's not been on the radio. So, again, we'll have to wrap it up in this final segment for today because there's much more going on. And the good news is your evolution as a scientist researcher and that work of the Carnicom Institute, carnicominstitute.org, is evolving to the point where a lot more is known since 1999 when you first started. So you're going to go to the third part of this paper that we were just talking about, and I think that's very important. I'm just going to let you run with it about, you talked about the equipment, you talked about what's happening in the body, a lot of the negative effects. Pick it up from there.
Thank you very much, Alan. The third part of this paper is called Potential Mitigating Strategies. The third part of this paper is what you can do about it. Again, always qualified, acting as an independent researcher. There's no medical advice being given here, but again, I have the right to do research, that if I know the nature of something and I know its potential impact on the body, what might I do to improve the state of health, okay, in general? I'm entitled to that process, and this is what I offer to the public as an independent researcher. So this paper attempts to take every one of these major issues that arose through the course of the research about its impact on the body. And the interesting thing is every one of us has the freedom to go through this process. I don't need to operate as a doctor. I have the right that if somebody tells me I have too much acidity in my body potentially, what might I do to educate myself to improve that? And so the issues that arose, I'm going to summarize the issues that arose in the course of this research And I take them on as an individual the best way I can to the public, and it's a journey of education for myself. Others will know more or know their own. But these are the issues that arose, and I'll read these to us, and then realize that the paper is attempting to offer, hopefully, valuable information or it's not advice, but valuable information about where we go to improve this state of affairs. And the topics that arose in the course of the research were as follows: iron disruption, amino acid presence or lack of presence, and protein rebuilding, acidity, oxidative stress, availability of oxygen, thyroid and metabolism issues, halogen toxicity and substitution concerns, joint and skeletal integrity and elasticity, blood and cellular integrity, and potential neural disruption. Now, this can sound, some people get despondent when they're presented with a difficult situation. I simply don't react that way. I would prefer to be aware and to show willpower and motivation to influence the world around me rather than be a victim or a subject of it. And we as citizens, I think, are called upon to do that. And the end line here is that the situation is hardly hopeless, folks. What's hopeless is not becoming educated and doing anything about it. And by the way, education by itself means nothing. I've spent a lot of time in the system. Education and knowledge by itself means nothing unless you do something with it. And this is what we're called upon to do, and I'm doing it in the best way that I can for the public benefit. And so this paper goes through these various issues on each one of them, pulls up resources for every individual to look at and to study, and it's all open territory. But there's no excuse, I would say, for being ignorant anymore, and it's been a journey of education for myself. I have seen over and over and over the sort of the tendency that individuals have in our society to want a quick solution and a quick fix because we're being conditioned by that in MTV to see everything in a half of a second, and then you go on. It's not always that way, and people, quote, want a cure, unquote, okay? The work I do is nothing. I'm not a doctor. It's not my intent. The intent is to become aware and knowledgeable about what's going on, to interpret and analyze things, which is my general background, and apply it. And I think you and I were talking about this, Alan, offline a little bit, but the journey that I have been led to here is that in the course of this research, I have been called upon to study the issue of health on a general sense, not necessarily just a specific condition. I certainly have done that. But what you see is that the issues we're talking about are not restricted to one condition. If you look at any reference book on pathology, the causes of disease are actually known from a biological standpoint. They've been known for decades. And there are specific mechanisms that are interfered with, and there are specific measures that can be taken to improve that. And my focus over time has been towards an increasing appreciation and understanding of the role of nutrition in life. And to me, the understated praise that these individuals deserve for taking on that discipline in their life, because it's now clear to me that ultimately the energy that we absorb and express in our body comes from our nutrition and what we eat. It doesn't come from a supplement, not saying that everything doesn't have its place. It doesn't come from a pill. It comes from the nourishment that we provide our body, whether that's going to be, antioxidants playing a major role, or mineralization of your body to avoid the impacts of acidity. I mean, there are specific things we do, and they will all come ultimately from sources of nourishment. And there are things that we can do, and there is no reason that we need to act as a victim or a subject of this world. And as a matter of fact, that would exactly be the weakness, that if we're in ill health, you can no longer express your energy and spirit as a human being. And you need that energy and you need that spirit to take your place in the world. So sorry for my preaching there, but that's sort of the journey that I have gone through in terms of understanding this. The notion of a pill to solve life is very misplaced.
So part 3 gives not only the disruptive conditions that arise from the bacteria in the filaments that is in everybody's blood, according to your research. I mean, everybody is a strong statement, and you can address that after I finish this summary, that you also are giving some solutions that to me are related to how do you protect the immune system. A strong immune system will have less symptomatology of some of the conditions from the bacteria. A weak immune system may be what eventually breeds the filaments coming out of the skin with the bacteria in them. You summarize it in any way, but I think you've attempted to give solutions to a variety of conditions that all seem to lead back to what happens when this bacteria is released out of the filament in the blood. Is that correct?
Yes, it was the objective of this paper to try to help people realize that the research is not being done for research's sake, not because of interest's sake. The research over a period of a decade and a half has been solution-oriented and solution-driven and continues to be, and that we can all participate in that process and make things happen much quicker than they have if we're willing to assume that role and responsibility that we all play.
Yeah. And I don't know if this is the right time in our conversation to bridge to the other papers briefly in summary, cross-domain bacteria isolation and the new biology. But the profound aspects of this relate not just to the human being and the human blood. Is that correct? I mean, you telling me that genetics are affected, or plants are affected, or soil is affected, or other life forms are affected by these bacteria?
We must be willing to look at what is available to us regardless of how uncomfortable it may be. Mm-hmm. And there has been a difficult process for people to go through to consider the possibility that there might even be that original sort of linkage taking place between geoengineering and bioengineering, right? It's not comfortable territory to cross over. And so a lot of people prefer to stay in the turf of saying, well, maybe my weather is being fussed with. Well, I don't really know anything about that, and I can't really, make too much of it, and I'll go on with my life. And it's uncomfortable to pose the question of crossing the line between the Earth systems and biological systems. But the fact is, folks, they are interrelated completely. They are so intertwined, it is completely artificial to separate them. Now, that's the first artificial separation that has to be crossed in our process of awareness. The second would be the approach that has been taken to somehow try to isolate or catalog this particular condition, which was given this name, not in any scientific fashion, by the way, and that term will eventually require revision. But this condition, popularly called Morgellons, again, to try and isolate that to a few individuals. So the work shows, and the research shows, that picture is much broader than we might be comfortable with, and that the existence of this particular structure, from all appearances, I would never use the word ever because life is awful difficult for human beings to classify as absolute, but nevertheless, we could use the word dominant and prevalent to an uncomfortable degree. How's that for diplomacy?
That was good.
Okay?
I realized after I said everybody, I was treading in the wrong area, and I was asking for your correction.
But that's fine. The point is, again, willingness to look at it.
Yeah.
Take a look, folks, and see what you see in the evidence. But the evidence to me says you've got a bigger issue and a bigger problem than we might be willing to admit at this point. Now, that's the second level of transition that could take place for some of us. The third level, and here's a fair question. You can just start asking the question. If you did reach the conclusion that this particular structure was more prevalent and did exist in a broader segment of the human population than might be comfortable talking about, the question we get to ask is, can you exclude consideration of life forms beyond human beings being affected by that particular organism? Are you entitled to make a restriction to the human being alone? And how do you answer that question? You answer that question by being willing to do something that has taken me far too long to do. I actually had a hint of it about 5 years ago. But you take on that question by looking at something outside of the human being. And you look for these specific structures in these particular forms, which have both filament as well as the bacterial aspect to it. And you ask, is there something else that might have that? And one of the first suggestions that I will offer that we must be willing to look at is our food supply. Now, is it unreasonable that if you admit the existence of an environmental source for a problem, that ultimately it is at least likely to affect the entire biology of the planet? Is it possible? And of course, now one of the interesting notions is that in many cases we consider a certain bacteria or a certain virus to be restricted, let's say, to a particular species. That's been the common sense, that, oh, you don't have to worry about a bacteria affecting a dog because this isn't going to affect me. Well, one of the things that we will have to be increasingly comfortable with very quickly is we are in a different world, folks. Now, we are in a completely different world in terms of genetic engineering and the playing around that is going on with biology. We have crossed these lines. I pick up my biochemistry book from 1972, and the very first chapter where they're talking about discoveries in genetics, the very first suggestion they have is, I wonder whether or not we can mess around with biology and cross over lines we've never crossed before.
Yeah.
That's back in the 70s, folks.
Yeah. Well,
there's a line in the weekly news this week that states, this is common news, that skin cells are now being used to make liver cells. We've crossed all the lines that we formerly held as being defined about transitions from one biological state to another. And what I'm saying is, and this is why the paper is entitled The New Biology, is that the work and evidence now shows that the problems and questions that I'm speaking of in situations are not restricted in any way to human beings, let alone a particular class of human beings, but that fair game, by direct observation, measurement, as well as analysis, does throw into our arena our food supply and the general biology of this planet.
Yeah.
And that is where this paper comes from.
All right. Well, I'll just say more to come because we're almost out of disk space here anyway. Very comprehensive. Again, let me refer our listeners to the website, carnicominstitute.com. And
.org.
I'm sorry, yeah.
Okay, close.
carnicominstitute.org, right. And the only other thing I'd add is don't believe everything you read about GMOs and Monsanto as benefiting the planet. How's that as a sign-off? Anything you want to say?
No, other than I thank you again for being on the leading front of making information available to people with frank and free discussion on the state of our world and our role within it that we assume. And I thank you for it.
You too, Clifford. Thanks for the great work.
On the planet, and then really the viability of life itself if you start toying with the atmosphere. And this was my conclusion, and it remains my conclusion, and that's many, many years ago. And an appropriate term for that transformation would be that of geoengineering. Engineering is the willful and generally technologically driven systematic development of a system or alteration of a system to produce some kind of result. And this is one of mankind's creations, is a discipline in science of engineering. Geo is our Earth, and that term is appropriate. When you manipulate, alter the Earth in a systematic, artificial way through the conduct of human operations, that is geoengineering. It has taken place. It is in place, and the effects are in place.
Yeah, let's do this. That's a good background. I'm just going to take our first break here with Clifford Carnicom, and I'll give out the website too. It's Carnicom Institute .org, right?
That's correct.
CarnicomInstitute.org, where some of these papers in the early history exists. And then we'll come back. I just want to pick up where you left off, and we'll continue in what I will say to our listeners is a very logical sequence of discussion. I'll explain that when we begin our next segment. Clifford Carnicom on the line with us, and we shall return. We have returned with our featured guest, Clifford Carnicom, on the line with us. This is going to be a multiple part conversation. Clifford gave some really good background on the alteration of our environment. He is a scientist and a researcher, and started out, like he said, in 1999 to explore what was going on, which turns out to be some force of geoengineering or man-made interference with the natural rhythms on the planet, in the planetary environment, in the ecosystem, from the atmosphere down to the Earth itself.
In 1999, it became painfully clear and obvious that something important and a transformation was taking place in our atmosphere. And so the simplest level of my work was that of just documentation, simply taking out a camera, recording it and saying, hey, what's up, folks? You have any awareness or interest in what's happening here? And that process probably took at least 2 years. And there's a whole progression of work that took place. It did get increasingly sophisticated and complex over the years, particularly in response to the lack of response by those that were expected to respond. In other words, if you have some type of obvious change in your environment, and we're talking about something you can see, okay? Listen, pollution and mass and material in the sky is something you can see. And the most direct and obvious way of recognizing that is with your visibility levels. This is why so much effort was paid towards the Clean Air Act and improving visibility. You know, Los Angeles was a better environment than in decades prior when you went through the smog legislation. It is possible to clean the air, and those stats and numbers will show that progress back in those decades if you look at them. But there was a lack of response when the citizens justifiably and appropriately called for investigations and disclosure on what were these changes in the environment. And that's what forced the work to continue. It was unexpected. It was certainly a change in my life. I come from a military family, actually, with my father. I have, let's call it an awareness of the structure of society and the need for, let's say, order as well as organization. I'm aware of that world, and also respect for institutions that are entrusted to serve the public. I was a federal employee myself. I was a public servant, and that's why I was there in the federal government. I wasn't there for security. I was there as a public servant because I do believe in those ideals and those needs. There are other aspects of life besides just the profit motive and government.
Clifford Carnicom on our studio line as a featured guest, returning to the show. We get to talk maybe once a year. It used to be more frequently in the days from 1999 to probably around 2004, 2005. Just by way of review, Clifford is a scientist, a researcher. He's one of the founding members, or the founding member of the Carnicom Institute, formerly based in Santa Fe, New Mexico, now out west a little further, where Clifford has his laboratory and his research facility, and is working with a team of people on a variety of subjects, broadly under geoengineering and bioengineering, and what's going on with those areas of science and research related to the Earth, our environment, the sky, and particularly as it may have nexus or connectivity with aerosol spraying, or aerosols as they're called. Some people, and I know, Clifford, you as a scientist take exception to chemtrails as the descriptive term. However, it is like, a slang term. It's a cliche term, chemtrails. I don't know when it was coined, going back maybe to as early as 1999 when we first met. So that's a little background on Clifford. And I think the first thing is to do a little update or review all of your research right now, including something we're going to get into, which is Morgellons and bacterial microscopic analysis. I think stems back to somewhere in 1999 when you and I came together after a radio show, noticing there was weird stuff going on in the sky. So I welcome you back, and let's start with that. An update on aerosol sprays, a continuing phenomena, getting some
is ideally to suit that role. And so over the years, we saw the work became increasingly complex in terms of it would then progress towards environmental sampling out of necessity. If you say something's there and you ask somebody to look at it, nobody does anything that they're supposed to do. In fact, they're given statements of denial and contradiction to their most basic common sense. Then the process of environmental sampling has to start taking place. And unfortunately, it has to start taking place then at the citizen level, which is what I got involved with. That should never have been necessary. It's not the right way to have the work done. It's difficult. It's time-consuming. You're reinventing the wheel in a lot of ways because you're not using the systems that are actually available, as well as equipment and resources. But it was done to the best of my ability, at least, and you will find a rather extensive record on that environmental sampling that took place over many, many years. I suppose the conclusion from that work, which was made many, many years ago, and everyone else needs to reach their own decisions, need to, read the work and become familiar with the work, and not just myself, but of anyone they feel offers verifiable and honest, good faith work. There's well over 300 papers that I have written now over the last 15 years. It is quite extensive, but if you look at that work, there is an appropriate time for myself, at least in a position, to simply conclude that our planet has been changed. This is beyond the notion of some, experiment or trial or project. The fact is, the conclusion that I made many, many years ago was that this planet had been systematically and deliberately changed in a physical sense. And my work started with the atmosphere. If you go to Maslow's hierarchy in terms of survival, you're not going very far without air to breathe. It'll probably be at the top of your list if you're getting cut off from something. And so you do not affect the atmosphere of the planet without inflicting great consequence upon everything that dwells.
Some traction in the news. If you do online Google research, whether it's chemtrails or aerosol spray, you're going to find a bunch of stuff. You're going to find news shows covering it in a very, I got to say, superficial way. And I think, Clifford, you and I may have been hoping for whistleblowers to show up between 99 and now, and some have in minor ways, but it just has not gotten any traction in the mainstream media. So let's begin with that. What do you think?
Sure, Alan, and thanks a whole lot for the chance to be here again with you. We have a great time, and you're pretty much on the leading edge of a lot of the topics that I'm doing work on, and this is no exception today. So thanks again for the opportunity to be here.
Sure.
And, if we just recount the history, at least in brief, my work did start in the beginning of 1999, and there is an evolution of the work that takes place, beginning at fairly elementary, but nevertheless sort of profound levels of knowing that something is very unusual and very wrong, essentially, about changes in the environment without any type of public involvement or discussion. If we take on the issue of just air pollution at the most basic level, we know that the effort and attention and organization that took place in this country during more of the environmentally active decades of 70s and particularly 70s, I suppose, where we had legislation developed that recognized the rights and the needs of the citizenry to a healthier planet. And a great deal of sacrifices was made, both economically as well as industrially, to accomplish those objectives. And that, unfortunately, was somewhat trashed and thrown to the wayside. And it's not a single date where things start. You can actually go back to the origin of our capability, particularly with aerosol operations, do use aircraft. That history goes back as soon as you were able to do it. It's a tool, it's a machine, and it's able to be used for things beyond flying, and a disbursement device can be one of them. So in 1990,